so happy to see you, Paul Johnson.
So, Ann, you asked about private schools and that debate. I'll talk a little bit about it.
Okay.
I'm not an expert on it, but do you get the emails from the Kansas Association of School Boards?
I do, yes.
I mean, that's who I would direct most people to go to for, because they're starting to move. You know, they passed out of committees, and
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, and I heard, I mean, the thing that came in yesterday said to get a voucher for a school, you don't even have to be an accredited school. They can get
Right.
a voucher for even an unaccredited school.
Right. Homeschooling. Yeah.
The school vouchers, does that include like people that send their kids to like Catholic school, things like that?
Yes, I think there's limits on which schools you can get vouchers from. Like if you are attending one of the 100 lowest schools or something like that, you can get a voucher to go anywhere other than that school.
Oh, okay. Because my grandkids in Hayes, they started at Catholic school and they're just continuing. So
Mm-hmm.
they just chose that when Condra was born and decided, and now all three of them are, one at TMP and two at Holy Family.
There's been some white flight in Hayes. That's Hayes, you said?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Kids who didn't want to be in with the Hispanic kids went to the Catholic schools, but then there's Hispanic kids at the Catholic schools too. So
I was gonna say that's a lot. I mean, I see a lot of the kids there, and my grandchildren are half Hispanic, so.
Oh yeah.
But you know, there's a lot of them there, and
yeah.
And then a lot of them go to Holy Family kindergarten through 5th grade, and then some of them then transfer to the public school for middle school.
I see.
So,
yeah.
I've seen that. But
people do that here too.
These bills, they expanded beyond just the 100 worst buildings, and they also raised the eligibility from, now it's free lunch, and they add reduced lunch
if this
to that,
passes,
which goes from 150 to 185% of poverty. The essence of this is, what hasn't changed yet is that there's a $10 million cap on how many vouchers, the cost of the vouchers. And I don't think they're going to change that this year, but I think the point is to get the policy changes in place. It's well worth going to ksb.org and reading their daily legislative updates on how this legislation is moving. And this is my 41st year as a
wow.
card-carrying lobbyist.
Wow. How'd you get started on that?
Well, actually, I was working as a paralegal for when Kansas Legal Services was put together.
Oh, wow.
When Topeka, Wichita, and Kansas City melded together. And so I got hired at that point. Actually, I started on, it's a longer story, but I started on utility issues. And I was watching the Kansas Corporation Commission. That's when I met Roger McAllister, who was the first director. And so he wanted to do utility cases, so he hired me as a paralegal to stay with it. And I sat through the Jeffrey coal plant case in Wolf Creek, and then we got some money and hired a couple attorneys to do it and hire witnesses. So I got transferred to be kind of just a lobbyist for legal services at the state capitol. I saw the Residential Landlord Tenant Act went through at that point. Under Lance Burr was involved, and Windmill Willie and some of those folks. And and I worked on a plain language contract law. I always thought it would make sense that contracts should be in readable fashion. Of course, we never get that by the bar here. And then 1980, Reagan gets elected, and the promise was that he was going to kill legal services outright. He couldn't pull that off politically, but one thing he did put into play was that legal services was prohibited from lobbying. So I got transitioned to what was called the Public Assistance Coalition of Kansas to work on poverty. And I had I was getting contributions from a number of churches, Methodists and Catholics by the largest, but the Episcopalian, Lutherans, and so that's what I did for 25 years.
How long have you been doing lobbying work for the League of Women Voters?
It's been 6-7 years now. I eventually my politics ran afoul of some of the efforts that the Catholic Church was making and their funding, et cetera. So they cut me loose, and so I made a pitch to the rural center, that Kansas Rural Center, that I would lobby. I would lobby for them, and then I've worked with the league off and on. In fact, they were with this Public Assistance Coalition I talked about in the 80s. So I've known the league for a long time. And a good friend, Leonore Rowe, who now lives in Kansas City, she's in Emporia. She approached me on the league's part to be a mentor or consultant to the league. So I don't register as a lobbyist for the league, and I don't speak for the league, women voters, but I just, provide counsel and insight, and, try to keep them abreast of issues. I'm going to start with redistricting. It's still kind of somewhat of an open question as far as process is concerned. We'll look back 10 years and see how they did it then, and is that going to be repeated here in 2021 as it was in 2011? And essentially in 2011, there was a joint committee, advisory committee. It's primarily legislative leadership from the House and Senate. They were on the start of the process, and they adopted proposed legislative guidelines on how districts should be drawn, and do you put incumbents together and communities of interest, and so it's worth reviewing those guidelines, and you can find that in a court decision, because it was the federal district court in 2012 that ended up drawing the districts in Kansas, because the legislature couldn't get its act together to pass something with the House and Senate, couldn't agree on it. And then the governor's a player, so it's a veto process. So we'll see if that joint advisory committee is going to be set up, or whether it's just going to be what's called the Legislative Coordinating Council, which is the majority and minority party leadership from the House and Senate, and whether that will be the body that will draw up these guidelines and then start laying the groundwork for public hearings in Kansas. It looks like the census data, as we all know, it's been a fiasco. It looks like the state numbers aren't going to be ready until the first part of August. And then, and census numbers do not have a partisan bent to them. So you get the actual person count by community and county, et cetera. And then out of the Secretary of State's office, there's a software package that layers over the partisan nature of it. So you know how many Democrats and Republicans and independents are in the area. There is a standing House committee that's been appointed House Redistricting Committee. There's also provision for the Senate to set up a redistricting committee. And so they'll, that has not yet been appointed. So, and these committees are on call, meaning they don't have fixed schedules or fixed timelines right now. So we'll see how this evolves. I think in essence, we're probably going to see public hearings early fall up to the winter, then to get actual maps drawn, and then the debate over the particular maps and changes to that will come in the 2022 session. And I needed to check the timeline here, but what drove the federal court decision in 2012 that ended up choosing the maps that were settled on was a congressional timeline. You had to file for congressional seats, and that may be the case, and that would be probably about the middle of June in 2022 is kind of the timeline that they have to set. And as I said, the governor is a player in this, and so the governor would have veto authority if she so chose. Then the question is, now that we have supermajorities, the Republicans in the House and Senate, will the governor be a non-factor? And then, and some of this, I'm no attorney, and so, trying to understand all the technical aspects of this, but the Kansas Supreme Court will review the maps 15 days after they're finalized, the end of the 2022 session. And then we'll see if they're plaintiffs, we'll see what the questions are in numbers. So that's kind of what I know about redistricting at this point, that it's a work in progress, that we're waiting for the Senate Redistricting Committee to be appointed. We're waiting to see if the LCC is what guidelines they're going to propose that these two standing committees use. Next topic is really, is tax policy in Kansas. And there's a Senate Bill 22 that's going to be debated today on the Senate floor. And there's a lot of moving parts to it, but in essence, it does a couple things. It makes pretty substantial cuts in corporate taxes in Kansas, kind of to build off the 2017 federal tax reductions we saw. And the second item is now in Kansas, if you take the standard deduction at the federal level, you cannot itemize expenses at the state level. And so they need to pass a stat, 22 would do that, would allow people who don't itemize at the federal level can itemize at the state level. I think it impacts only 8 or 10% of the filers in Kansas. The cost is still being, figured out in all this. I think it's somewhere, this package is in the $200 to $250 million cost range that obviously then is going to have to be factored into how we put a budget together at this point. Another tax bill that's moving, that's gotten a lot of coverage, is Senate Bill 13. And it's in essence what they call a transparency tax bill. And in essence, it tells the county that if property values go up higher than inflation, and they have this board or some entity that's going to say what's a revenue neutral figure for property tax increases. If it goes beyond that level, then the county is forced to hold an election on it to get permission to spend that extra money. A couple editorial comments about this. One, the state has made repeated promises ever since 2000 to help the counties with revenue issues, from local ad valorem property taxes to city county revenue sharing. I mean, the state's made a lot of promises to the counties that they were going to help them with some of the funding, and they've basically backed away. The state's gone broke, and so they, and since 2003, the amount of money that should have gone from the state to the counties is about $2.5 billion. So, and the last thing I'll say is, I mean, property taxes is its own, it's a question of how regressive or progressive it really is. But especially in terms of agriculture, all other property from residential to commercial, industrial, whatever, they're valued on market value of the property. We passed a constitutional amendment in Kansas so that we tax agricultural land at a use value versus the market value or sales value. And so when you look at the charts for who pays property tax in Kansas, 45–50% of it's residential, 25 to 30% is between commercial and industrial. You have about 10% utility, and ag comes at an 8% of the property tax paid in Kansas. So is that the fairest way? We can talk about that. Before this call really started, there's bills moving that will expand tax credits or vouchers to send students from the public schools to private or parochial schools. This legislation has been in play 2 or 3 years, and it was very tightly drawn, and you had to, a student only had to come from one of the 100 worst public schools, and you had to be under free lunch criterion, under 150% of poverty to be able to qualify. And what these bills are starting to do is they expand that eligibility from 150 to 185%. They also open it up to virtually all schools, and then it gets real questionable about what is accredited. Do private or parochial schools, what kind of criterion do they have to meet to be able to get access to these credits? Right now, this program is capped at $10 million is the sum total of the credits. I think I was telling Ann that I think what the plan here is to put these new criterion into place, not change that $10 million cap this year, but in a couple years to expand that to 100 million or whatever. This may get down a little bit in the weeds, but how they do budgets up here. On the House side, when the governor's budget comes out, they've divided the committees up. So you have a social services budget committee, you have a general government budget committee, you have a higher education and K through 12 budget committees. And these budget committees have both members from House Appropriations that eventually makes the final decision. They also have non-appropriation members on these committees. And so they go through their particular budget and make recommendations back to House Appropriations, and then the House Appropriations Budget Committee then puts the whole package together. In the Senate, up until this year, the Senate Ways and Means was the only budget committee, really. And the members of the Senate Ways and Means Committee are then broken down into subcommittees, and they take various parts of the budget from higher education to K through 12 to social services to public transportation, and those subcommittees would listen to the budget presentations and then make recommendations back to the full Ways and Means. What changed this year is that these budgets are now being farmed out to just the regular standing committees. So this morning, I was in Senate Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee, which in the past has never dealt with a budget. They just dealt with policy around ag and water and natural resources issues. And suddenly they're now doing the budget work for the Kansas Department of Agriculture, and they're going to do the Kansas Water Office and the Division of Environment within Health and Environment. So it's kind of an unsettling time. What I would say about it is it's amazing. Like I listened to the Department of Ag's presentation this morning, and they had all of 20 minutes out of an hour because they were doing the state fair board also. And then tomorrow, the committee is going to make final recommendations. I mean, it's like watching speed dating, I think, in essence. So, and I'm not sure why they're so sped up to it's a 90-day session. We're in day 20, 21 at this point. Obviously what's going to impact the budget is if they pass any of these tax packages and cut revenue, what that's going to mean. There's a lot of prayers and hopes here that this new stimulus bill that's going to come out of Congress in the next few weeks will have some direct impact, some direct contribution to state and local governments. And then probably more decisive factor comes in the middle of April when our consensus revenue estimators get back together, and they meet twice a year, and this group makes the projections of what the revenues are going to be to Kansas. And then the legislature and the governor, all the players then have to use those numbers. And if those revenue pieces change, then obviously they've got to factor that in. They're gone from about first week of April, then they come back about the first week of May for what they call their veto session. And so, and maybe the last topic I'll talk about for questions here is there's a couple bills going on election laws at this point. People are trying to narrow down or advanced voting in Kansas, and how many ballots can you collect from your relatives, or to take to the voting site. So we'll see if that gets any traction at this point. The committee was fairly hostile in some of the questions they asked about it, and they thought people were looking for a problem to solve at this point. And the other bill is what happens when, like we've seen, Jake LaTurner was state treasurer, gets elected to Congress, who then fills the state treasurer's position. And right now the governor has a free hand at selecting the replacement. And so in this case, she moved her lieutenant governor, Lynn Rogers, in as state treasurer. What these bills would do is basically take it away from the governor and give it to party conventions. So the Republicans would choose the replacement for LaTurner. The same would also apply to if there was a vacancy in the insurance commissioner's job. who fills that? Does the governor do it, or do you send it to the party committees at this point? And Scott Schwab, as our Secretary of State, really didn't come in with a package of ideas to change election laws, or one of the things that's still on his plate that hasn't been dealt with is that they've passed legislation in Sedgwick County, which has the hardware to do this, that you can vote at any site in Sedgwick County. And Schwab's been under the gun to write rules and regulations, so that might be able to apply to other counties as well. And that has yet to, he keeps saying that he's still working on it at this point.
In view about the appointments, do you have a view about which would be the most moral and efficient, and what would be the best way in your view?
I'm not sure I have a dog in that fight. Let me put it that way. I'm not sure I've thought a lot about it. It wasn't a problem when a Republican governor was making those appointments, and so the tables turned here about partisanship at this point. So it's kind of just, I think, flexing of a muscle that the Republicans want to. So I don't think at this point that I have any silver bullets for that.
So you don't think we could get a bill that only Democratic governors or former Democratic governors could appoint?
I think
you don't need to answer that question.
I think a bigger election issue is how partisan are we going to continue to draw legislative districts in this state, and what the league's working on, and what a number of other states have passed constitutional amendments or set up nonpartisan redistricting commissions, which I think would be pretty is essential to do this. And I've made the pitch to the league that a lot of this is pretty arcane, and if the league has the capabilities, working with kindred groups, can we come up with what we consider a fair and balanced map at this point, so that when it gets to the press, you've got a clear comparison of what the Republicans are probably going to draw up. I hate to say this, but I wouldn't doubt that they would look at trying to bring Wyandotte County into the first district to.
Yeah. Do you have any idea about what, and I don't mean to monopolize, but coming back to that question, what might be other groups that would have the ability to draw those kind of maps?
Well, I think, the league works with the ACLU, and they're, and actually, I think, and I should know this, but I think the state league got a grant from the National League to draw up, to help with a fair map process. So, and Seal King, co-president, assures me that she thinks that they can find the resources to come up with a map at this point. So yeah, I think it's doable. I think we need it for comparison purposes to what we call, if there were a nonpartisan redistricting commission in Kansas, what results would you see from that? This would be a way to showcase that.
I have just a question about a general topic. Part of the pandemic has brought out all these inequities by poverty, by the poor people come out worse. And
Yes.
I wondered what you're seeing in the legislature that affects poor people.
Well, I wish I could be more positive on that in some ways. An
Positive.
issue that I give some thought to and I've written about in Policy Watch is our child support payment center and child support enforcement system in Kansas that involves, and to Laura Howard's credit, Secretary of DCF, she found the funding to do a really critical review and assessment of the problems we're having in child support. It touches 245,000 kids in our state. It's about 1 out of 3 kids. It's last year, child support payments were about $430 million. So it's, you know, it's critical for thousands and thousands of Kansas families. And we rank somewhere, you know, 40th, 42nd out of the 50 states in what our collection percentage is. The national average is about 65% current monthly support collections, and we sit at about 55%. And Brownback privatized the child support system in 2013, and they set up 10-year contracts. So in 2023, that's going to come through for, that will be the critical time if we want to move back from some of that privatization and reinstall some of the staff at DCF. And I could spend many more minutes talking about that system. And then, you have, what's good is Lauren, DCF cares. And they want to make a difference. And they, just as bad as we are with child support, we're in the 40s out of 50 states in the number of people who are eligible for food stamps who are actually getting. There's some people that are, raising the right metrics about what we ought to be working on. And God knows what we could say about the foster care system and that debacle that we privatized that under Graves in '96, and it's only been in the last, I think, 3 or 4 years that we've really taken a serious look at what happened to that system. And so.
Medicaid expansion?
It seems a lot less likely this year, given a number of the conservative moderates, semi-moderates, Republicans that got knocked off, as you know, in Salina. I mean, if you want my absolute truth, I think what it's going to take is the closure of 8 or 10 more rural hospitals. And that we just, a stark awareness. I mean, this COVID focus should have been more than enough in and of itself to help with explaining, the need for medical care. But I mean, you've got such a diehard. I mean, last year what held it up, because people know that if they can get this legislation to the floors, that they probably have the votes for it. Maybe not in the Senate now, but certainly in the House they do, because it's simple majority. But last year it got connected to the abortion amendment, constitutional amendment, and Susan Wagle said, until you move that, we're not doing anything with Medicaid expansion. So now, as you know, they've pushed through the constitutional amendment question. It's going to be on the August 2022 primary ballot on, women's health. And so they don't have a ready excuse to say, that's not blocking Medicaid this year.
Well, you wouldn't want to save any lives through medical care if you can't save them preventing abortion.
Well, that's, a question I would have is, where's Kansans for Life in all this now? You know, now that they've gotten their constitutional amendment, are they going to be a player in health coverage for more people? And I don't think the answer is they're not enthusiastic about it, even if that.
Anybody else thinking of questions? You can do it. Come on, think of some questions.
I have a question.
Okay, Amy.
On SB 13, I know that school districts are exempt from that. Is that correct?
That's right. Uh-huh.
Is there any consideration of exempting other taxing subdivisions from that?
And I'll have to admit, I've not been down in all the exacting details about this, so I'm kind of looking at that a bit of a distance. So it passed the Senate virtually unanimously, and I don't know if the House is going to make any amendments to it at this point. It's such an easy thing to just say that it's transparency, and if the counties really, they need the extra money, they ought to have to, publicly pitch for it. And we've so narrowed the revenue base for counties, and what is property tax and some sales tax is about 25% of the income in many counties, but counties are really desperate, and the state's got to do something else to assist with revenue options for counties.
Amy, do you mean like I was just thinking of extension districts. What districts kind of are you thinking of?
I know that Central Kansas Library System has presented on that, and we are one of 3 public libraries that has its own taxing subdivision.
Okay. So you have a dog in that fight. Our dog is not taking offense at anything that's said here. Other questions? Let's see. Paul, is there something else that you've been following that you haven't talked about today?
Well, I kind of look for fundamental issues that probably drive my interest in politics. I've never been much of a partisan player, and not into a lot of the games that go on around party politics up here. But a couple of issues that do really interest me, I'm trying to spend some time. One is on housing, and the governor's office announced the end of December that they're going to do they're funding the first statewide housing needs assessment that we've had in 25 years. Actually, those stopped after Graves left office in many ways. So they're going to spend 2021 collecting the new census data that's now coming out on housing and costs and percent people are paying for housing. And then they're going to have a number of stakeholder meetings with various players, from community bankers to realtors to community mental health centers, AAAs. So I'm trying to work with people to broaden the number of stakeholders that will have some input. And then what I'm hoping is that we can put a policy group together here in Topeka that looks at kind of the statewide issues that if we want to lay the groundwork to come back in the next session with policy recommendations. And I would, a couple of quick ones. One, Kansas has a state housing trust fund, but it has no revenue source for it. So we've never built up the trust fund, which is really vital. I mean, if you want people to get that first time home loan, many times they need certain down payment assistance or other assistance that you could fund out of if you had the trust fund had some revenue in it. And the other piece that interests me a lot is energy. And Kansas is out of 50 states, we're one of 8 states that does not have a statewide energy plan. And so, and we have, the governor last year proposed executive order we have a very sparse energy office within the Kansas Corporation Commission. And it only's got 2 or 3 people work, at it. But it gets federal money from DOE. So there's some options of how we spend that money that I'm working on. But I'm hoping that we'll take some of that federal DOE money and start laying the groundwork for a state energy plan in Kansas. That really all we've looked at the last we paid $1 million for an electric rate study, which is fine. I mean, I think we ought to look at, and our electric rates are somewhat higher than all our surrounding states in the national average. So that gets into, many other issues. But we've never really had, a true energy plan in Kansas would look at both natural gas and electricity and our conservation options going forward, because 70% of the homes in Kansas are heated with natural gas, and they all have electricity. And how do you blend those together? If you do an audit on a home and you get both heating and cooling savings, how do you piece all those numbers together? So, and a good piece of news in my mind is the governor now, there's 3 members on the Kansas Corporation Commission that regulates the large investor-owned utilities. She put Susan Duffy on it a year ago, and Susan's a longtime Topekan and worked in legislative research, and her last job and she worked at the KCC, but then she was also the head of the Metropolitan Transit here in Topeka. That was her last job before. She's chairperson of the KCC now. And then her second appointee is a guy named Andrew French, who happens to be the son of Jim and Lisa French. Strong environmental background there, So he just got confirmed 37-0 on the Senate floor about 2 weeks ago. So he's now on the commission. And between Susan Duffy and Andrew, I feel like we could see a sea change in how we look at energy policy going forward.
I want to interject that if you read the regular newspaper, actually, the Salina Journal, which some of us still do, you had Mr. French asking a question with a somewhat raised eyebrow about the requested additional funds for Evergy, and
right.
questioning whether it's more important to send, I'm partly reading this in, whether it's more important to send dividends to shareholders versus the cost of electricity. It's more detailed than that, but.
Well, and that's the point. I meant, and I've written about this somewhat too, but when with stock filings at this point, if you own over 5% of the stock in a corporation, then you're listed. And so when you look at Evergy today, the top 4 stockholders are Vanguard, BlackRock out of New York, and T. Rowe Price. And then the latest entity is Elliott Management. Paul Singer, Republican contributor. So those 4 entities own between 35 and 40% of the stock in Evergy today. And I can give you a couple numbers here. In 2018, Evergy had total sales of $4.3 billion. That was their total gross revenues. They declared out of that 4.3 billion, that 535 million of it was their net revenue. And when you read their K10 filings, they usually take 60 to 70% of their net revenue, 60, 70% of that $535 million, and that goes to investors. It's about $350 million a year. And I mean, would Kansas be better off if Evergy was ratepayer owned, or if the rural electric co-ops and the municipals went together to buy the company? I mean, I think it's an open debate. The state of Nebraska, you know, the socialist state north of us, doesn't have they don't have one investor-owned electric utility in the state. It's all public power. So I don't know if that's ever plausible for a debate as I sit here in the Capitol, but.
Paul, I have got to say, I am just in awe of you being able, how you do those figures, how you keep that in your head is just beyond me. So, you know, you can't tell, but I'm already on my knees. I had to carry my laptop down with me. But my question is, has anybody at the Kansas Reflector, you just wrote an editorial. Would you consider writing that editorial for the Kansas Reflector if nobody else?
I wrote an editorial, an opinion piece on the Farm Bill that ran on November the 22nd.
Right.
And I was going to, I made a pitch to write something on child support that I was talking about. I have pretty good correspondence. CJ Janovi is kind of the coordinating editor, as you know, and Tim Carpenter, longtime reporter here at the Cap Journal, was hired. I mean, they hired some good people, as you know. So it's not that I haven't had the debates or discussions with some of those people, and it's a question that really should be asked, and it should be debated, and God bless us that they've put Kansas Reflector together and they offered that. I really enjoyed that op-ed piece that Norland, is that right, Dave?
That's Dave right there.
I'm proud to hold that name.
No, I'm sorry.
In this case, there are others. Yeah, right. Yeah.
So, Paul, a couple of things. Quick question: how did Andrew French get a unanimous approval in this conservative legislature? That's a short one,
yeah,
but
they were worried about it. Quite honestly, Scott Allegrucci, who's the appointment secretary for the governor's office, was worried about it. He went through during the off season, you know, when the legislature's not in session, there's a Senate Oversight Confirmations Committee. And so that's where his term started, kind of on an interim basis. And he had a strong advocate from Jim Denning, who at that point was the majority leader in the Senate, was on that committee. So gave him kind of the you know, I think he even got a letter from the Coke industries out of Wichita.
Wow.
So
the other end is, why is everything going so fast? I mean, I've been talking to Clark Sanders, our new guy for the House, one of our new guys in Salina, and he was saying they had a big hearing in the morning with some preliminary information, and then afternoon they had to final vote on that very same issue, and it was just like a train running by. And why? What is up?
well, part of it is that committee chairs control they control the whole show. And so you have no standard committee rules that run between committees. So if a chair wants, you know, they pick the bills that they want to hear. They, you know, they can be biased about how well they give opponents or proponents, you know, testimony. And then they can move it at their will at this point. Now, it obviously has to go to the floor, and then, you know, things, you know, may clog up there a bit. And a lot of it is, I mean, if the Speaker or the President of the Senate wants something, they have kind of an ultimate authority. They pick chairpersons and committee members. That's their sole discretion. So it's kind of a get along, go along process up here that, so if, you know, that's why we saw the, you know, the abortion amendment run as quickly as we did. That's why we're, you know, they're trying to rush through some of these tax cuts for the people who probably put a lot of these legislators in office. And they're a little worried whether COVID, you know, whether that's is that going to catch up with this legislature as it has in Missouri and some other state capitals where some of them have started to close down.
One thing I've seen that Ruth had her mute off, and so I kept wanting to know if Ruth had a question there. Are you here with us, Ruth?
You are so perceptive, Anne. What a great moderator. You had talked about the bill to put the constitutional amendment on the ballot, and you said August of
2022.
Wow. Okay. So it's a year and a half off.
Yeah, some people tried to move it up. First of all, and I need probably clarity from you know, legal scholars up here exactly that. Somebody told me that, you know, we've as you know, we've bifurcated our election cycle now. So in the odd number of years, you have the nonpartisan, and then the even number of years, you have the partisan. And I thought somebody told me that you couldn't put a constitutional amendment on the odd number of years. That may not be true, because one of the senators up here made the motion to move it to November of this year to vote on it, because his backup plan was that if they lost it in November, they could bring it back in 2022. So, and you get into, you know, since it's, you know, independents usually don't vote in primaries. And so, you know, in August of 2022, there's going to have to be, you have to rally people to go, you know, if they're an independent, just to vote on that issue.
Well, that's part of the point, I think, though, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But if you want an honest answer here, you know, I mean, do you have any doubt that it's probably going to pass? I don't know. I mean, you know, is it going to pass in Kansas? But how mobilizing an issue is it to turn people out to, you know, to vote? And, you know, given the choices that, you know, the governor's race will be in November of 2022, you know, for you know, for policy strategy things, you know, should getting it out of the way in August, you know, what does that do? You know, how does that deal with turnout then in November?
I guess, could you explain that a little more?
Well, it's just if you put it on November of 2022's, you know, the general election ballot, you're also going to have Kelly, you know, running for re-election against, you know, whoever the opponent is. How much of a motivation factor is this constitutional amendment going to be to turn out more people? That's I think that's and or could it play both ways? I don't know, but
So
I hope I explained that right.
I still don't quite understand what your opinion
Maybe
is.
Annie can help facilitate this.
Let me just try that. I mean, if it's going to be a partisan, you can assume a partisan, more conservative Republican vote. That may turn out more conservative Republicans in the primary, which is traditionally what's happened, right? But then
Right.
I think what Paul's saying is then when you get to the governor's race in November of that year, perhaps, and so we don't know, but perhaps there's a better chance of a more moderate Republican or Democrat being elected governor. And
Yeah.
of course, Kelly hopefully being reelected. Yes, is that right, Paul?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So I understand they had to make a special law that made August 2022 a special election to be able to put a constitutional amendment on that ballot. So then it would allow non independents to vote. Is that the difference, maybe?
I'll plead ignorance on some of the technicalities here. What I do know is that you have to vote in a primary, Kansas, you have to select a party. And so independents would be going to this August primary just to vote on this constitutional amendment. Maybe David, do you have a different take on that?
No, I think that's right. And so that's the threat, isn't it? That independents who pride themselves on being independent won't declare either party and therefore stay away from the election.
Yeah.
And I don't think they will have to declare a party to vote in this election.
No.
But that is what they don't. And I think that's because it's a special election, because it has a constitutional amendment on it. But independents are used to not being able to vote in an primary election. So unless they're very well informed, they're not going to be there at all.
That's right.
And not to get too technical about it, but do I understand you right that it has to have been declared a special election then so that independents do not have to declare a party at the primary?
I'm not quite sure about that, but I know I heard that it was declared a special election. And that I think may be the reason, because otherwise you had to declare a party to vote in a primary.
Okay.
So we're about close to the end of our time here. Any last questions from anybody? Okay. We really appreciate you, Paul. Let's give him a hand, virtual something. And thank you so much for being here.